So, welcome to our usual Monday routine. So, today we are going to do the work about German cinema, primarily sort of two and a half major movements. So, we're going to look at um, early German cinema, particularly Expressionism, make a brief stopover in some Nazi propaganda, and then we'll finish up with what is considered new German cinema beginning in the 60s and 70s. So, here we go. Okay, so we're going to begin our German cinema review here with some early German cinema, um, particularly the German Expressionist movement. But just to give us some chronological context, so we're looking at what's considered the Weimar Republic. So this would be the years um, right around World War One. For very early German cinema is pretty stagnant and basic until about 1912 when they started to sort of respond to other movements happening in Europe. In particular, was France's film d'art movement, in which German theater directors started to adapt for the screen, particular literary adaptations. So the term Autorenfilm actually translates roughly to famous authors' films. So this is sort of similar to traditional quality films in France. So thinking about safe literary adaptations. One of note was Max Max's production of Der Andere in 1912. Largely, this kind of thing was just filmed lit, and I see this is not going to allow me playback, so I will put these links on Weebly as well for you to take a look at later. But essentially, we're looking at what we call film lit, and in which it's basically a theater performance that is sort of taped rather than a film creation in of itself. So there isn't any kind of sensibility about what the cinema can do, and more is about just sort of showing us what happens in the story. But also of interest was the film Der Student von Prague by Stellan Rai in 1913. And while this was much the same as Max's Der Andere, it does start to show some more filmic sensibilities, something a little bit different than what had happened prior. Specifically, was really important was the deep psychological content that sort of raised eyebrows of people saying, there's something else happening here. It was a dark film, very much a Faustian kind of story. As a matter of fact, I think it was inspired by that story. So it was a combination of that shift towards thinking about cinema, but also the content. Expressionism comes as a, expansion comes as a result of isolation. And Germany was cut off from distributors in the US, France, and Italy because of World War One. So it forced them into a collaboration with Scandinavian filmmakers who had remained neutral during the war but still lacked an overall production. So the Scandinavian directors were sort of apolitical about the issue as opposed to the rest of Europe and the US. Uh, but they also needed each other in terms of production materials, personnel, and those kinds of things. And what resulted is the creation of UFA, which translates to the Universal Film Craftsmen's Guild in 1917. So UFA is essentially a nationally subsidized conglomerate. It was intended to counter any anti-German film propaganda coming from other countries, and that did exist, in fact, post World War One. So they were trying to sort of establish themselves as a legitimate art form. All German production companies were ordered to come together under one name, and they were very nationalist, sort of propagandish type work. And this does help the German market grow tremendously. It's roughly 10 times its pre-war state. So even though it was sort of a nationalist response to World War One, UFA organized the film industry in Germany. But it was really just a distributor for smaller production companies. So essentially, there's a lot of little people who could come under the blanket of UFA that allowed people to start thinking about film and thinking about the possibilities in film. Post World War One, there was sort of a rejection of the past and an engagement with political liberalism. So people really starting to think about other means of expression. And one of those things meant, liberalism being quite literal, ultimately resulting in very liberal themes, but also, you know, quite blankly pornography. So there was a few styles of films that became very popular in the early 1900s. One was the Sittenfilm, which would be films about sexual contact, or the Aufklärungsfilm film, which was films about the facts of life, so explaining those kinds of things. Also, lots of interest in narcotics and altered states and those kinds of things. For example, this film, Opium, from 1919, directed by Dr. Robert Reinert, um, explores this idea of drugs and altered realities. Excuse me. But this type of film essentially sort of backfires, and let's see if I can spring forward here a little bit for you. In its attempt to liberalize the country, what it actually does is become fuel for anti-Semitism, because those who were sort of not ready for this liberal explosion of sex, drugs, and whatnot, um, were kind of frustrated and concerned about where this was going. And so it was a very easy way for the Nazi Party to reinstate censorship. So part of the problem here was that the Jewish population was associated very early with the entertainment industry, much like we see that happen in New York in theater and also in Hollywood. But it was happening here as well. And so because of the Jewish connection to the German film industry, and because of these types of films, it allowed the Nazi Party to institute the Reich Film Act in 1920, which was a sort of very elaborate censorship act that kind of started to pave the way for eventual propaganda. UFA was also, at the meantime, just of note, was producing a lot of lavish, extravagant multi-reel films, the kind of things that were coming out of MGM and whatnot in the U.S. A bit later. Of interest was Ernst Lubitsch, who we'll come back to, who was into musicals and costume films, an extremely competent and innovative director, who, like I said, was doing things on sort of the grand Hollywood scale. And he will actually end up in Hollywood because of that work, but we'll come back to him in a little bit. So what's important right now is to take a look at a film that sort of kicks off what we consider the German Expressionist film period, and that is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The film came out in the early 1920s as a radical anti-authoritarian script. It was directed by Robert Vine, who also worked with Fritz Lang, who you may already know, who adjusts the frame story to shift the radical tendencies so it's not so anti-authoritarian, but to kind of create this as the musings of a madman. So anything that was considered to be anti-authoritarian gets shifted to look like the fact that this character is just insane. So it softens the blow and allows it to exist under that Reich Film Act censorship. And this became announced as the beginning of expressionist style in film. And we're going to take a look at some of this, and then we'll take a look at the clip, and then we'll talk about some of the characteristics. I'm going to talk over the music as loudly as I can here, but you want to take notice of the angular set, the lack of reality, the immense concentration of shadows. 1920s was the tip off of Expressionism in film. Expressionism existed significantly before that, particularly coming into Germany around 1908 and starting in the fine arts, particularly paintings and theater. Expressionism in and of itself favors distortion of reality. So it's a way to look at sort of the inner psyche, human emotion, all of those kinds of things, violence, fear, all of that kind of stuff sort of generated on paper or in the theater in this kind of distorted view. So it almost represents the sort of how things feel as opposed to just telling you a narrative about it. So you have things like Die Brücke, which is the bridge. This is actually for the film version, but this started in theater. And you have lots of paintings, which you see. This is the Blue Rider. And you can see those angular, distorted versions of reality in a lot of these films from people like Mark, Kandinsky, Kirchner, Heigl, Haeckel. And so looking at some of these paintings, it becomes very clear where someone like Vine took his influence. So basically, moving on to the core characteristics of Expressionism, they are the same as they would be in film. A lot of stylistic distortion, not necessarily as graphic as Caligari. Caligari looks like a painting sort of come to life. So there's varied forms of this kind of stylistic distortion and in little more subtle ways. Um, but in terms of composition, the mise en scène, the three dimensional space is more important than the human characters. The actors are sort of just moving around in the space. A quote from actor Conrad Veidt: "If the decor has been conceived as having the same spiritual state as that which governs the character's mentality, the actor will find in that decor a valuable aid in composing and living his part. He will blend himself into the represented milieu, and both of them will move in the same rhythm." So the idea of using these highly stylized sets and costumes and all these kinds of things, chiaroscuro lighting, which is the sharp contrast and from dark and light, so a lot of shadow and whatnot, high key lighting. Um, the idea is that all of that will influence how the actor participates in the film. And so that external piece is a direct influence on what happens for the internal performance. Lots of exaggeration and repetition, um, uh, lots of facilitation of the close up so you could see the exaggerated character's face. And remember, this does come out of theater, so that's sort of not surprising. When in theater, you would have to sort of exaggerate those motions as well. Editing and camera composition. Editing was relatively simplistic. The shot composition guided the narrative rather than the edit. So we're not looking at anything related to sort of montage here. And the camera is also quite basic. It's straight on, again, thinking about sort of pulling out of the theater. So we're just looking at a action happening in one space. So it's not necessary to kind of move the camera all over the place in sort of crazy angles to get those distortions, but rather to create the distortions within the scene. So again, heavy emphasis on mise en scène. So let's take a look at some of these other directors. Particularly, this one is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, which you may already know, one of the earliest vampire films. Murnau was. I'm going to pause this for 1 second. Actually, just put it down. So Murnau was an art historian by trade. So he, again, understood the artistic movement of Expressionism quite well. He understood the capabilities of the camera in the film better than Vine did. So his Expressionism is a bit more filmic rather than set-based. So you'll see him play with angles a bit more sort of cinematic dissolves and those kinds of things more than Vine did. Murnau was a disciple of the Kammerspiel film, which is this kind of intimate theater instinct film in which horror comes in realism. So things that seem real but maybe aren't, the reflection and reaction to the Expressionism. He was also a fan of the subjective camera, in which the camera becomes the eye of the character. And we saw a little bit of that in Cleo from 5 to 7. But Murnau uses it to a much more sort of chilling result. much of Expressionism you will find has to do with dystopia, fear, horror, as some obvious things here in Nosferatu. But you will see the that theme of kind of various forms of horror and fear play out. And I think it makes perfect sense in sort of building that time in between the two world wars and the rise of the Nazi Party and sort of how all of that was affecting Germany at its time. And certainly, as we mentioned before, um, the reflection on the violence and the bloodiness of World War One. There's a lot of interesting things too here. If you go into sort of FYI about Nosferatu, about the actor Max Schreck who plays the vampire, who was sort of our first method actor who became so consumed by his role. It's rumored that he was a heroin addict as well, and sort of became so consumed by Nosferatu that he had trouble um, kind of coping. And there's a great film that came out not too not too many years ago um, called Shadow of the Vampire, in which they play with that rumor, that sort of myth about Max Schreck, to great results. John Malkovich plays plays the vampires, or I'm sorry, plays Murnau, and Willem Dafoe plays Shrek. It's a great film, although probably highly made up. Of course, it's completely made up. But anyway, moving on, we also have Metropolis by Fritz Lang. And this is a great film in terms of both exhibiting not only Expressionism, but the Art Deco of the time. I'm going to kind of move ahead here. You can see the stylized buildings that lots of rhythm. Lang was a great architect, so not a great Shortly after the Expressionist period, we have the creation of the Dawes Plan. And once a while, Expressionism really did make a lot of advances in studio production for German cinema. It also did have major advances in set construction, lighting, and all of those sort of creative realities in that regard. The Dawes Plan, particularly, was put into place to stabilize the German economy and halt post-war inflation. So this is a post-war effort by the U.S. But what this also does is restricts exports, so these films don't get out of Germany, and it causes a lot of production companies to fold. Hollywood takes advantage of this and sends tons of films to Germany, knowing that they can't fight back. So it boosts the Hollywood industry tremendously, and this essentially cripples UFA. So what happens is Paramount and MGM both offer a bailout. So what they did is they helped pay off UFA's debt with significant interest. But then that meant they got the rights to their studios, their theaters, often a lot of their personnel, so actors, directors, etc. And what results is Para UFA Met. So Paramount, UFA is UFA, and Met is the Metro and MGM. And that comes into play in 1926. This still isn't enough. Alfred Hugenberg adds more cash to the bailout and gains significant control for the Nazi Party, which will lead us into World War II. In the midst of all of this economic uncertainty, a lot of the artists that were working in the German Expressionist period in German cinema leave for Hollywood, partly because of the Para-UFA-Met merger. So you have people like Ernst Lubitsch, the musical director, who comes over here and starts tons of major musicals here. Murnau actually leaves and becomes a Hollywood director. Michael Curtiz, he comes over here to the U.S. and does Casablanca, his most famous film. Paul Laney is another one. And we also have the actors Conrad Dietz and Greta Garbo. So Germany's loss is, of course, our gain, but it does mean that UFA loses most of its serious talent. The loss is temporary, however. Hollywood wanted a different kind of product than what these people were doing in Germany, and unfortunately, many of them actually ended up coming back to Germany to participate in the industry simply because their style just didn't kind of work with what was happening in Hollywood at the time. So essentially, as I mentioned, the Dawes Plan and the mergers and whatnot had already started to cripple the industry, and this has left it wide open for the Nazis to consolidate and bring everything under their control. So to begin with, of course, we have we have Hitler, who needs no explanation, I'm sure, who had put in Joseph Goebbels as his minister of propaganda. And between the two of them, managed to create a serious system of propaganda, of slogans, of films, both anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi, all sorts of creations of various forms of propaganda, and they had utilized film quite tremendously. Most famously was Leni Riefenstahl, who unfortunately, as a sort of forerunner for women as directors, and particularly in documentary cinema, was a fantastic artist and had an eye for composition. But she used it to make some of the most famous propaganda films for the Nazis, excuse me, particularly Triumph of the Will in 1935.
Es gibt keine Revolution als Dauererscheinung, die nicht zur vollkommenen Anarchie führen müsste. So wie die Welt nicht von Kriegen lebt, so leben die Völker nicht von Revolutionen.
Also of interest are some animated propaganda films on both sides of the story here. I'm going to show you actually some German ones, and then just sort of for some interest, I'll show you one that actually came from Disney. So this is an early German animated film. Again, using various cinematic techniques to play to various audiences.
Zweiter Weltkrieg beginnt. Der Bevölkerung. Die Igel sind jedoch zum Kampf bereit. Sie tragen den Stahlhelm der Wehrmacht. Die Igel-Armee ruft die Luftwaffe zu Hilfe, das Wespengeschwader. Die kleineren Tiere verbünden sich, um mit vereinten Kräften den Fuchs aus dem Wald zu vertreiben. Der Störenfried läuft als Vorfilm.
On the flip side, Disney was contributing to the war efforts as well, making some anti-Nazi propaganda. It was a little jarring to see Donald Duck dressed up as a Nazi and reading Mein Kampf. However, the idea here was that Donald Duck's experience as a Nazi would turn out so horribly that he'd realize that the American flag and the American ideals would save him.
When the Führer says, "Wie ist the master race?" The Heil, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace. So the Heil, right in the Führer's face. When Herr Goebbels says, "We own the world in space," the Heil, right in Herr Goebbels' face. Then Holt Göring says, "They'll never bomb this place." The Heil, right in Herr Göring's face. Is he not a Superman? Arian Führer Superman? Ja, wie ist der Superman? Super duper Superman. Is this Nazi land so good? Would you leave it if you could? Ja, this Nazi land is good. We would leave it if we could. We bring the world new order. Heil Hitler's golden order. Everyone a foreign race. They love the Führer's face. Then we bring to the world disorder. Then the Führer says, "Wie ist the master race?" The Heil, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace. So the Heil, right in the Führer's face. So the Heil, right in the Führer's face. Heraus, ein Hund! Nichts kann raus! Into the closet! Here, improve the mind. Heil Hitler! When the Führer says, wie ist the Moscow race? He heil, right in the Führer's face. Not involved the Führer. Welcome, workers of Naziland. What a glorious privilege is yours to be a Nazi. To work 48 hours a day for the Führer. Then the Führer says, we never will be slaves. We heil, but still we work like slaves. While the Führer brags and lies and rants and raves, we heil, and work into our graves. Hey, Lisa! Get to work! Then the Führer yells, I gotta have more shells. He heil. For him we make more shells. If one little shell should blow him right through, he'd heil, and wouldn't that be swell? Is this not wonderful? Is not our Führer glorious? Heil Hitler! What's that you say, Schweinhund? Verdammter Esel! Heil Hitler! Attention, workers! Through the kindness of the Führer, now comes the vacation with pay. Ah, the beautiful Alps with the birds, and the beautiful scenery, not forgetting to build up the body so we can work harder for the Führer. I hit that. 1, 2, 3, heil! 1, 2, 3, heil! 1, 2, 3, heil! 1, 2, 3, heil! And now, the vacation is over by special decree of the Führer. Heil Hitler! You have been chosen to work overtime. We need more shells! Shells, more shells! We need more shells! We need more shells! I'm going mad! Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace. So we heil, right in the Führer's face. So we heil, right in the Führer's face.
After the war, Germany was, of course, divided into East and West, with the East under Soviet control. The East German cinema, the industry primarily was located in the old UFA studios. However, the Soviets controlled all of the equipment, the industry in general. and there was a nationalized film production under the auspices of the German Film Company. In West Germany, the former UFA president becomes the film commissioner, and there was sort of a decartelization of the industry. Post-war concerns immediately after the war um, dominated the content of the film, but gradually the success of those films led to something a little bit lighter in terms of content. By the 1950s, Germany was the fifth largest producer of films in the world. They were still competing with American production, and they suffered the same hit from television in the 1950s, so competing with the cinema experience versus the at-home television experience is much the same as what happened here in the U.S. And production begins to slow down considerably. So it's important to know that at this point, content, because of the post-war feelings, had become sort of light, a little fluffy, not a lot happening in terms of cinematic innovation. Again, playing it safe in order to keep the economy up in that regard. And this wasn't sitting well with filmmakers who had been paying attention to other more radical film movements happening elsewhere. Thinking about what was going on, starting to shift in France, what was happening in Italy, what was also happening in the United States. And so we're going to take a look here at what is known as New German cinema. And this all begins at the Oberhausen Film Festival in 1962. And so Oberhausen Film Festival in 1962 had been going on for several years at this point. It was a relatively international film festival, both German and U.S. and other films were being shown there, French, Italian. But what comes out of that film festival, particularly for the Germans, is of what's interest. And the manifesto itself was basically 26 writers and filmmakers that signed this manifesto that demanded the establishment of a new cinema, a young cinema. They wanted it to be more independent. They wanted to not be confined to industry regulations, those kinds of things. No commercial partners, no dictation of stakeholders. Thinking about innovation, thinking about risk. One of the quotes from the manifesto itself is that conventional film is dead. We believe in the new film. There's a tagline, although it doesn't actually appear. This is the manifesto itself. If anyone speaks German. This tagline doesn't appear in the actual manifesto, but it became known as sort of, this is not your father's cinema. So thinking about ways in which German filmmakers could just do something wildly innovative, something that shakes off the past. And this, by 1962, I mean, it's sort of a general feeling in cultural moments in Germany anyway, of sort of, and still to this day, is like reconciling with what happened during World War II and the Holocaust, and sort of how can they regain their own identity as the sons and daughters of this period. So as I said before, it was a demand of new forms of freedom. It was a personal expression, thinking about what was happening everywhere else. This is the list of signatures there. They established the Young German Film Board in 1965 to kind of implement the manifesto. And this was headed up by people like Alexander Kluge and Norbert Kuckelmann, who we'll come to in a minute. This also helped to fund the creation of two state film schools, one in Munich and one in Berlin, and also a film archive in Berlin. And so this is a pretty significant move into cultivating a new cinema and training new artists and bringing people up in this idea of artistic freedom, as well as taking care to archive and collect the films that have been made and sort of think of them as sort of proudly of a new Germany. So we'll come back here to Alexander Kluge. So he was one of the primary people that sort of led the march there with the Oberhausen Manifesto. He also formed a group. It was kind of a co-op that was known as the Filmverlag der Autoren, which is sort of, again, kind of auteurist filmmakers, thinking about how they could all work together. Becomes kind of a formalized art movement, much like the New Wave, much like some of the other things that are happening in Europe. However, what's interesting about Kluge's work and really about all of New German cinema is that there are no formalized technical characteristics. And in fact, it was exactly this that is sort of their characteristic in and of itself. As Thomas Altsasser, who's a film critic, talks about it, they had a refusal to be explicit. So the idea here was that there are no limits. There is no style. There is no specificity to New German cinema. It's just something new. It's your own expression of how you want to uh, do film. And so one of these things helps is sort of the thinking about marking the first step towards rebuilding Germany and thinking about this new young generation that was both psychologically and physically displaced, often some of them, having shifted to either East Germany or West Germany, restricted by the wall and all of those things. Volker Schlöndorff's Young Torless in 1966 is identified as the first film of the New German cinema. But we're going to talk about Kluge here first. Kluge was actually an assistant to Fritz Lang in his younger years. Much like a lot of these European filmmakers, they were sort of Renaissance people. They weren't just filmmakers originally. He was a lawyer. He was an academic. He was a novelist. He's considered the intellectual father of the New German cinema and was sort of the main spokesperson for the Oberhausen Manifesto. Kluge's work focuses on a precise investigation of social problems via a single protagonist. So thinking very focused on like large-scale ideas, but through the lens of one individual. And so this is a clip from his film in 1973 that he's probably most famous for, Part-Time Work of a Domestic Slave.
Ich vermag auf keinen Fall einzusehen, dass ich bei dieser Kundin einen Kunstfehler begangen haben soll. Es ist deshalb eine bodenlose Unverschämtheit, wenn Frau Bronski als meine Konkurrentin die Kundin abwirbt und ihn für mich rufschädigenderweise zu einem bekannten Arzt bringt. Deshalb habe ich mich entschlossen, Frau Bronski bei der Kripo anonym anzuzeigen. Das ist im Allgemeinen nicht meine Art, da ich eher ein feiner Mensch bin. Das Polizeipräsidium, Kriminalpolizei, Sittendezernat. Hiermit erstatte ich Anzeige gegen Familie Bronski.
Sind Sie Frau Roswitha Bronski?
Ja?
Können wir Sie mal eben sprechen?
Ich habe jetzt keine Zeit. Worum handelt es sich denn?
Wir wollen nicht stören, aber es ist wirklich sehr dringend.
Da sind zwei Frauen, die sind von der weiblichen Kripo. Die wissen gar nicht, wo meine Praxis liegt. Die sind nach der polizeilichen Anmeldung vorgegangen.
Habt ihr einen Haussuchungsbefehl?
Damit sind die noch nicht rausgerückt.
Wenn wir die jetzt rausschmeißen, kommen die mit Sicherheit wieder.
Dann musst du für mich mitgehen. Ich schaffe alle Beweise weg.
Ich setze mich in die Zelle und sage nichts. Was ist denn hier los?
Sie sind Herr Bronski, Kriminalpolizei. Uns liegt eine Anzeige wegen Paragraph 218 vor. Wir machen Sie darauf aufmerksam, dass alles, was Sie sagen, gegen Sie verwendet werden kann.
Das kann sich nur um ein Missverständnis handeln. Ich sage nichts.
Ich schaffe alles weg.
Okay, so moving on to another director who was quintessential New German cinema artist, Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Fassbinder began in the theater, and because of that, he often played with improvisation in his films, sort of both through the actors and through his thinking of how he was going to play things out. Topically, he largely considers class rifts and those sorts of issues. He's most known for his film Kasselmacher from 1969, which translates slang for outsider or foreigner. in which the story is a boy that is lynched out of jealousy. Um, Fassbinder is greatly influenced by Cirque and other American melodrama directors. Stylistically, he was a disciple of Godard, so you'll see a little bit of both of those things. This is the trailer for Kesselmacher.
Halt's Maul.
Ist auch ein Stuchtaski.
Ein Dreck.
Aber der ist schon gesessen.
Der ist der und ich bin ich.
Außerdem ist der gut, da spürt man schon was bei dem.
Gut ist der meine auch. Und spüren tue ich auch was.
Was ich auf der Bank habe, das geht dich gar nichts an.
Davon verstehe ich nichts. Ich muss leben. Das ist alles.
Das habe alles nicht gekauft! Das lässt du da! Und überhaupt kriege ich noch Geld von dir!
Du hast mich doch lieb. Im Herzen und so.
Aber das hat mit Geld nichts zu tun.
Eine Liebe und so, das hat immer mit Geld was zu tun.
Bitte, bitte lass mich in Ruhe mit dem.
Ehrlich! Lass mich voran!
Kein Geld nicht wert.
Dass die dich überhaupt ranlassen?
Ich habe bezahlt dafür, wenn du das genau wissen willst. Ja, ich kann es mir leisten, weil ich arbeite und habe Geld genug.
Einfach so mit einem Fremden, das kann man doch nicht.
Die hat Geld. Und die, wo Geld haben, die können alles.
Hast du gesehen, wie die glotzen, die Weiber vom Haus?
Nein,
Aber ich. Weil ich bin in die Schule gegangen mit denen. Die neiden mir meinen Besitz.
schau ihn an, wie der schaut.
Ein Ausländer.
Jetzt kommt er schon her.
Magst du was, hä?
Suchst du da was?
Was bist denn du für einer?
Kannst nicht reden, wenn man dich was fragt. Was bist denn so komisch?
Du bist komisch, ich bin normal.
Dann leg mich am Arsch.
Nee. Im Sommer nimmt er mich mit nach Griechenland.
Und seine Frau?
Das macht nichts, weil in Griechenland ist alles anders.
Der muss weg.
Genau. Eine Ordnung muss wieder her.
Moving on, we have Werner Herzog, who many of you probably already know. He's still making films. Herzog studied and worked in the U.S. for many years before he came back to Germany to be a filmmaker. He was and still is obsessed with human flaw and our inability to hide it. He loves the idea of quirkiness. And if you know anything about Herzog, he sort of embodies quirkiness in and of himself. In terms of his work in the New German cinema, he's most famous probably for his films Kaspar Hauser and Stroszek. Kaspar Hauser was 1969, Stroszek was 1977. Both star Bruno S., who's this gentleman right here, an institutionalized schizophrenic. Bruno S. Is sort of an unknown person that Herzog picked up and plopped into his films, who really does in fact have some kind of mental illness, and people don't really know much about him. Again, he's part of one of the Herzog myths. You know, he's someone sort of mysterious that appears in these films. In Kaspar Hauser, that's a dark and disturbing interrogation of mental illness. So using kind of an old German story and interrogating mental illness that way. Stroszek uses cinematography to mirror the mental state, so to think about how the camera can make us visually see mental illness. And in Strozek, it's all about devastating humor, as humor is our only means of survival. So it's a sort of absurdist look about this German transplant in Wisconsin in the 70s. And it's in that kind of uncomfortable humor where you're not even sure if you should be laughing or not, but there's also something hilarious all at the same time. So this is a clip from Caspar Hauser in which the main character discusses the idea of logic.
Du Caspar, der Professor ist extra hierher gekommen, um ein paar Fragen an dich zu richten. Weißt du, er will deine Denkfähigkeit prüfen. Er will wissen, was du in diesen 2 Jahren gelernt hast und ob du logisch denken kannst. Willst du noch eine Frage beantworten, ja?
Ja. Gut. Caspar, stell dir vor, hier ist ein Dorf. In dem Dorf leben nur Leute, die die Wahrheit sagen. Hier ist ein anderes Dorf. In diesem Dorf leben nur Leute, die lügen. Von diesem Dorf führt ein Weg auf dich zu und von diesem Dorf führt ein Weg auf dich zu. Und du stehst an der Kreuzung. Es kommt ein Wanderer und du willst wissen, kommt er aus dem Dorf der Wahrheitssager oder kommt er aus dem Dorf der Lügner? Um dieses Problem zu lösen, logisch zu lösen, hast du eine einzige Frage zur Verfügung. Bitte sage mir diese Frage.
Das ist doch für den jungen Herrn viel zu schwierig. Das kann er doch gar nicht wissen.
Ich gebe zu, es ist nicht ganz einfach. Wenn er nämlich simpel fragt, kommst du aus dem Dorf der Wahrheit, dann würde derjenige, der aus dem Dorf der Wahrheit kommt, der Wahrheit gemäß mit Ja antworten. Derjenige aber, der aus dem Dorf der Lüge kommt, würde lügen und ebenfalls mit Ja antworten. Es gibt aber die Möglichkeit einer einzigen Frage, um dieses Problem zu lösen.
Ich finde das alles viel zu schwer, viel zu kompliziert.
Du hast die Möglichkeit, Caspar, mit einer einzigen Frage dieses logische Problem zu lösen.
Ich wüsste es auch nicht.
Caspar, wenn du es nicht weißt, werde ich sie dir sagen. Wenn du aus dem anderen Dorf kämest, würdest du dann mit Nein antworten, wenn ich dich fragen würde, ob du aus dem Lügnerdorf kommst? Über die doppelte Verneinung wird nämlich der Lügner zur Wahrheitsaussage gezwungen. Er wird nämlich über die doppelte Negation zu seiner eigenen Identität bestimmt. Das nenne ich Logik, über Argumentation zur Absolutheit.
Ja, ich weiß eine andere Frage.
Ja?
Es gibt keine andere Frage. Nach den Gesetzen der Logik gibt es keine andere Frage.
Nein?
Doch, ich weiß eine andere Frage.
Dann sag sie uns doch.
Ich würde denjenigen fragen, ob er ein Laubfrosch ist. Derjenige von Wahrheitsdorf würde sagen, nein, ich bin kein Laubfrosch, weil er die Wahrheit sagt. Der vom Lügnerdorf würde sagen, ich bin ein Laubfrosch, weil er gelogen hat. Und daher weiß ich, dass derjenige vom Lügnerdorf kommt.
Nein, das ist keine Frage. Nein, das kann ich nicht anerkennen. Das hat nichts zu tun mit Logik. Logik heißt schließen und nicht beschreiben. Das ist doch nur Darstellung. Das ist doch nicht Logik. Das ist doch nicht das Zusammenfügen
von... verstehe.
Ja, das Verständnis ist doch nicht das Ausschlaggebende. Der Schluss ist doch das Wesentliche. Als Professor der Logik und Mathematik habe ich nicht verstehen gelernt, sondern da habe ich schließen gelernt. Ich kann diese Frage nicht anerkennen.
Lastly, of the major list, and of course this is not an exhaustive list of the new German filmmakers, but we have Wim Wenders. Wenders studied at the Munich Film School. Topically, Wenders is consistently, and still to this day, explorations of existentialism. So thinking about our position in the universe and sort of who we are and why we're here and what any of that means. Michael Covino described Wenders' work as a worldwide homesickness. And so this idea of placelessness and just sort of psychological dysplasia, really mirroring the anxiety of the new German cinema, trying to define what it means to be German in a post-war Germany. He's most known, I shouldn't say he's most known, but his sort of primary work in the new German cinema, it started out as a short filmmaker and then progressed to this kind of epically long expose of two men's travel, contemporary malaise of two men sort of like working through their own ideological problems. Think of it as sort of a German Easy Rider called Kings of the Road. And here's a clip right here.
Quietsch, ne?
Okay, so that wraps up our exploration of German cinema. We'll be talking about the Tin Drum after the exam on Wednesday. So in the meantime, while you're watching Tin Drum, be thinking about how it might be somehow reflective of some of these things we've talked about in New German Cinema. We will still have the exam. The study guides were emailed to you on Friday, so if you can't find them, check your email. I've been having some difficulties with the links on Weebly, but the actual files were attached to an email sent out on Friday. Remember to take a look at the take-home essay. Be prepared to turn that in when you walk in on Wednesday, and I will trade you for the objective part of the exam. So you'll be looking at mostly true, false, multiple choice, term identification, that kind of stuff. The exam itself should take us about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll switch over to talk about the Tin Drum. If you have questions about anything that is on the study guide, or as you're preparing your take-home essay, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Just a reminder that I will also have some extended office hours tomorrow. So I have office hours from 10 to 11 tomorrow morning, and then I will also have them from about 3 to 5, 5:15ish. And on Wednesday, I will have office hours from 2 to 4 from 1 to 4 as usual, a little bit longer than usual. So please don't hesitate to ask questions, shoot me an email, send me a text. Lastly, I also just wanted to offer you guys the opportunity to come to my Tuesday, Thursday section of this class, particularly to go over the stuff that we did today. So if you want that option, that class is held at noon on Tuesday in Lytle 228. You're welcome to come if you'd like to hear the lecture in real time as opposed to the video. So that's an option for you. And if not, you have this video. I will talk to you all on Wednesday. Like I said, if you have any questions, please let me know. Stay safe and have a good night.